And before we formally get started, I want to give a special thanks particularly to our panelists who will be joining us both live today as well as virtually. And as we think about the industry at a crossroads, where are we headed and where have we come? It's really important to consider and think back, looking across the past 5 years, when we think about, and we'll be discussing later today, where are we headed in the future? So with that, we'll take you through a little bit of a presentation. Feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to interject. Raise your hands, ask questions. We want today to be as interactive and dynamic as possible. So when we think about where have we come, right? The first half of this decade is we're almost nearing 2030. There's been a lot of changes. We went through a massive raise where we saw the broader market from an investment perspective almost arguably reach what you might consider a bubble in the 20 to 21 range. Considering how things are changing, not only from an investment perspective and how these dynamics are constantly evolving, companies, they're constantly restructuring. Running clinical trials is becoming increasingly challenging, and those dynamics are ever changing. Factor that into some of the changes from a government perspective, payer scrutiny, and a regulatory perspective. There's a lot of balls that we need to be thinking about, particularly as we bring new innovations to market. Post this peak that we saw in 2020, there's been a noticeable drop, particularly from the investment perspective, whether that be from the clear drop from IPO offerings, VC funding, and even R&D and partnerships. However, when we think about all of this, there is light behind all of this. When you think about the massive deal that we saw from Pfizer and Seagen, a clear kind of momentum and uptick in the recent months. Additionally, IPO valuations are continually potentially to rise back up relative to what we saw in the early half of this decade. And additionally, innovations are coming to market, whether it be in oncology and rare disease or others, or even if we look at the TSLP monoclonal antibody, right? It's for asthma. And asthma is a very different market than that of oncology and rare disease. However, the game-changing factor here is can be administered twice a year. Not only did they receive a sizable Series A financing, but within 6 months, they have since been acquired by GSK. So through all of this, it's trying to figure out how do we as an industry start navigating and bringing innovations forward, and where are those innovations? What are some of the unmet needs? What are the technologies that we need to be considering to address where the market is headed? It's not maybe unsurprising to many of you here that oncology kind of continues to be one of the larger components from an investment perspective, really almost at the global scale. Within that, you start seeing different segments or modalities where you start thinking about, okay, within oncology, what is there? Whether it be from the biologic perspective, small molecules, gene therapy, cell therapy. We're clearly seeing a very market almost, I don't want to call it a hockey stick, but when you look at the ADCs, you see a bit of that hockey stick curve almost coming up to a peak in the rapid investment. There's an infinite number of ADC companies today, and almost an infinite number additionally being continuously developed. While obviously I mentioned, the Pfizer Seagen acquisition, there's a continual amount of not only alliances, partnerships, but acquisitions when it comes to the players, whether it be Gilead with Immunomedics, AbbVie with Immunogen, various Daiichi alliances and partnerships, and Genmab with Profound Bio. The list continues to go on and on. However, if we contrast the ADC market relative to what we've seen in the cell and gene therapy, it's a slightly different story. While recently, or not too long ago, I guess we can still call it recently, there was a market uptick in interest from a cell and gene therapy. However, given some of the dynamics of bringing these types of novel therapeutics to market, it's more of a risky opportunity potentially from the investor community, whether it be manufacturing, lead time, and actually bringing the products to patients. However, with all of that really kind of being said, there still is promise, right? There's still continued pursuit in looking at where else can these therapies go and where might that be. Obviously, CAR T getting its start within oncology, but moving broader into the autoimmune system, particularly if we think about T-Immunity and what they've been doing of late. And trying to kind of paint, though, what are the firsts that we've been seeing over the past 10 years? This list is completely not exhaustive, and there's probably many that are being excluded, right? Obviously, with kind of the rise and eventual as LOE comes for the immunotherapy and the checkpoint inhibitors, it kind of started off, 2017 as one of the first tumor agnostic modalities. This wasn't the first tumor agnostic. This really kind of kicked things off if we go beyond immunotherapy. We then saw agents such as NTRK, BRAF, and others, such as RET, kind of gain those broader market, almost tumor agnostic indications. Obviously, well, the first FDA gene therapy approval is not the first gene therapy approval. As we all know, some of the earlier ones, I believe it was in the 90s, didn't see as quite great success. But it's through this persistence from a scientific innovation perspective that really helps kind of bring these novel technologies to patients and address some of the ever-evolving unmet needs. Now, if we take a little bit of a temperature check of where we are today, what you can kind of see here is thinking about from a VC funding perspective. The bar chart is almost looking at, based on what we were projecting at the start of the year, where are we tracking halfway through? From a broad VC fundraising perspective, arguably ahead of over 50% of where we anticipated we would be at the half-year mark. However, what we're seeing from early technology deals, there's been a bit of a pullback. And I think whether it be within the tech sector here, which kind of excludes the healthcare industry, we're starting to see it as well as that broader understanding of what is that de-risked opportunity. And additionally, as we all saw earlier, and as we all know, there's been a limited number or a reduction of initial public offerings from an exit perspective. Whether that's leading to more alliances and partnerships, it's really understanding how do some of the smaller biotechs or even mid-sized organizations start working with some of the larger pharma organizations. Fruits of innovation, arguably a pithy title for this, but what this is really kind of showing is in the top left-hand side, I'm terrible at stage left, stage right. We've seen a shift in the dynamics where there's potentially a pivot towards new indications or new combinations versus new molecular entities. So those first initial FDA approvals. And additionally, what you're seeing and aligns to some of the market challenges that we've been facing as an industry is there really has been a reduction or really almost kind of a squeeze of the mid-sized company where there's a lot of innovation continuing to come out of smaller biotechs and almost kind of a more of a steady state when we're looking at things from a big pharmaceutical perspective. One of the things that I found relatively interesting, kind of looking at the bottom chart, what we did is we wanted to understand for those new molecular entities, how many fell into oncology, whether that be solid or heme, how many fell into rare disease, and then the multitude of others that kind of fall into the gray here. We were starting to see a market change or almost kind of shift and an increase in rare disease approvals. And almost kind of some of the declines in other areas, which I'll kind of speak to and kind of show from where are the clinical trials being invested in today in the subsequent slides. Really, obviously, beyond oncology and rare disease, it's kind of hard to ignore the GLP-1 market today. It's clearly kind of been on the uprise and growing, but we wonder if there are some of those same questions that we face from the ADC perspective. Has the market already become too saturated? How many products can we actually bring into the market? And what is the benefit and the need from a patient perspective? And one of the greatest challenges that I know many of you in this room today face is the severe cost of actually bringing a product to market. From a cost perspective and a complexity perspective, we've consistently seen an increase in what cancer therapies cost to the patient. Probably make this same case from the rare disease lens of when treatments are actually modifying the disease itself. Additionally, not only within the US, whether that be from the IRA or ex-US, we're continuing to see kind of an increase in access challenges and scrutiny from regulatory bodies. As I kind of started off a few slides ago, tumor agnostic, broad indications. As we're continually addressing unmet needs, some of the trends that we're starting to see is almost maybe a pivot, and it'll be interesting to hear Anne's discussion later today, not to reveal anything, but towards a biomarker-driven approach, towards those subset of patients. So from a diagnostic perspective, kind of relatively interesting from the US, this is one of the first times at least I'd heard of it. I'm not saying it hasn't happened before, but AbbVie is covering the FR alpha testing for their product Elahere, which recently launched. Typically, this is something that you might see in more ex-US markets, but it's really starting to constrain and focus in on the importance of having a unique and well thought out diagnostic strategy. Additionally, from the regulatory perspective, if we think to some of the FDA discussions, particularly over this past summer of wanting to understand the contribution of components when thinking about perioperative treatment. The therapies given in the neoadjuvant setting and then in the adjuvant setting, what is actually contributing to those outcomes? Being able to subsequently design the appropriate trials or have an approach to eloquently say or communicate to the FDA, you're not overtreating your patient. You're providing the appropriate therapy to the right patient and still delivering a strong, efficacious product at the end of the day. As we think about additionally, whether it be gene therapy, more recently, maybe radioligand therapies, and even cell therapy, the complexity from a cost perspective is challenging, not only in the manufacturing of it, but the eventual administration and thinking about how does that fit into the clinician's clinic. So that integration of these novel innovations is very different, right? It's different than hanging another IV bag, the patient sits in the chair slightly longer, providing an oral therapy. Some of these different technologies require a bit of unique challenges in thinking about bringing them and actually integrating them into clinical practice today. This chart I actually found relatively interesting. I think this kind of speaks to some of the elements that I was talking to on the last slide. We're increasingly seeing that increase in cost of actually pulling trials through to the registrational phase. However, we're also seeing a reduction in actual FDA approvals. From the revenue perspective, it's really important to understand and helping have the right funds to drive the innovation, to bring these therapies to patients, but really being able to make it viable as an organization and a business to bring the product forwards. And as we think about potentially shrinking patient pools or finding right and different patients, that increases some of the complexities as well. And I think this is a good, bad problem when, as that bar raises from an unmet need perspective and therapies are becoming more effective, it's becoming increasingly then more difficult to potentially overcome that barrier. How do we then develop some of these new approaches to think about addressing those core unmet needs? And endpoints is an interesting one. Obviously, it's very different from market to market. Quality of life often coming into play for HTA-based bodies. But are we using the right endpoints to really understand how a product is truly being efficacious? As we all know, the Fed recently actually reduced their interest rates, but how is that trend going to change for us as an industry? Is that potentially going to soften the market? Is not the right term, but potentially bring some funds back in from an investment perspective, having the market be maybe a little less bearish when we think about going towards some of those riskier investments. I think as we consider the US in particular and things from a global perspective, innovation really is occurring at a global scale. And I think it's really interesting to see what's coming out of China and how the China market is significantly investing from a biotech sector perspective. And not only are they doing, and we've seen this from some ADC acquisitions, right, but they're developing novel first-in-class therapies, as well as being able to compete we think about, the upcoming patent cliff for the checkpoint inhibitors, potentially competing at a cost level when we start thinking about biosimilars entering the market. And this kind of reduction in drug costs, potentially reduction in being able to develop therapies, there's a considerable clear advantage when thinking about the growth and kind of fostering, bringing a biotech forwards and bringing products to patients at the end of the day. So how do we, if we think of this from a US perspective or even think of this from a global perspective, understand our individual market dynamics to think about, do we need to pivot towards the more novel, or do we need to think about even considering, can we compete at the cost level as well for different types of therapies and bringing them forward? And with all this innovation, and this is, I think, one of the most, not necessarily the slide, is what the discussions we're going to have today with the panel. What are some of those potential solutions from a headwind perspective to address the ever-changing market of the biopharma industry? How do we think about, not running business as usual? Is it from a commercialization perspective? Is it from a clinical development perspective? Are there new technologies we can think about? Whether it be something from an innovative trial design, can decentralized clinical trials disease sectors? How do we understand really preventing some of these preventing cancer and some of these disparate issues, but making sure our clinical trials are appropriately diversified. So they truly are really representative of the population for when the product hits the market. I know AI is discussed literally in everything. It's not really the chat GPT of pharma, but how can we leverage some of these tools, whether it be in the drug discovery perspective? Is there something that can be utilized from, whether it's an app that maybe can provide information to patients? What can be automated? How can we leverage this technology that has an unimaginable amount of applicability across a various array of areas? Smart biomarker strategies, and thinking about, do we move towards a more hub and spoke model? In different sectors in oncology, and I've even been hearing it from the emergency medicine perspective, right? So one of my good friends is an emergency clinician. VCs are starting to buy up groups in different types of practices. This obviously provides a clear benefit, right? There's a greater access to capital. There's a supportive infrastructure. Are these unique approaches, whether it be from emergency medicine to the GU space, where we're seeing kind of the work with urologists that VCs are doing? Are there unique approaches that can be taken from a clinical infrastructure perspective to help bring these things forward? Obviously, the payer market is going to always change. But as, gene therapy as an example of this is a one-time therapy. It's a very high, expensive cost. To the broader budget of any payer system, whether it be within the US or ex-US, it's the one-time hit that's difficult. It's not the one or two patients that you might see that actually have this treatment. How do we then ensure that we can have the appropriate models that work with the payers, depending upon which market you're within? Is there a Netflix model? We think about payers. Obviously there's a mortgage perspective, milestone-based payments. There's been challenges with all of these, and they're not always the easiest thing to do, but is there something that can be done? So where are we headed, right? There's obviously lots of blue sky ideas, lots of possibilities. What you see here is looking at whether it be oncology, neurology, number of clinical trials from phase 1, 2, and 3, as well as NDA and BLA applications. This is really meant to kind of be an illustrative heat map of understanding where are there concentrated pockets, or maybe from a different lens of where is there potential opportunity. I think one of the unique things that I like about this representation is, rare disease as a collective is a sizable population, but it's all the small individual diseases. So you'll see, whether it be within oncology, many oncology indications are considered rare diseases. Other areas such as immunology or some of the metabolic disorders, as well as respiratory diseases, where you might see a higher concentration of clinical development there. And there's an array of different types of new therapies that are coming in. I mentioned radioligand therapies. There's been several recent acquisitions. There's a move towards the market from that lens. Similarly, we could think about this from a protein degrader. Mentioned cell therapy moving outside of oncology, moving into solid tumors even as well. What are some of those challenges that we're going to see, and how can we understand, whether it be from a precision medicine perspective or leveraging unique technologies such as mentioning AI to actually drive innovation and bring these products to patients at the end of the day. So through all of this, right, obviously we saw the big rise. We've been on a bit of a decline. What are we thinking today of the next 5 years? Obviously, we're going to talk about this throughout the day and towards the end of the day as well, but how are investors feeling about the future? I think there's a cautious optimism when we think about some of the macro trends that are happening, and really is bringing forth that level of innovation, understanding how to appropriately de-risk some of those investments. But I think with from the US lens, some of the anticipated, hopefully the trend continues, interest rate perspective, will we see that resurgence in VC with biotech? Is that space moving towards potentially larger players? I think as we understand costs as organizations, and I mentioned also at the start, as companies go through restructuring, what does that mean for them? Scientists, our industry, or many others, in actually bringing up and building new products moving forward. So there's a lot, and there's a lot that we're going to unpack throughout the rest of today. Obviously, dry spell might be too strong of a word. Maybe we're at the bottom of the valley and we're on the rise back up when it comes to investment perspective. At least that's my hope and promise. But I think it's really from our lens, understanding how we really optimize bringing products to market. How do we leverage and almost de-risk ourselves when we're working within our respective companies to, can we bring products to market faster? Can we do some of these novel technologies that we've seen, whether it be from an sRNA perspective? Can we improve that manufacturing? Are there things that can be done that will mitigate some of the concerns that we've seen from an investment perspective? I think this de-risking of the future can hopefully help disrupt some of the innovation and maybe be a less business as usual from that perspective. So with that, hopefully there are some reasons to believe, and I look forward to the discussions throughout the rest of the day.